So, today, let's talk about addiction grief. I think it's a topic that is commonly overlooked, something that I feel like a lot of people don't know about. I would say when we're talking about grief, and obviously you're the grief expert, so duh.
Not an expert, but I have some
Close
training.
enough, right? But we're always talking about like the death of somebody, like losing somebody. We kind of forget about this piece where we can grieve other things, especially addiction. You're coming into treatment and this is a whole part of your life that you're completely leaving behind, that we're losing, something worth grieving. Tell me, Kelly, how you saw the importance of grief work in addiction and when we're moving into recovery. Why is this key element so necessary for somebody who's new into recovery?
Yeah, so if I'm going back to when I first realized it was so important is when I was actually reading a counseling magazine that
Mm,
wrote about the importance of using grief work with addiction therapy. And when I
mm,
read it, I was shocked that I had not really heard of the perspective before because I realized how grief is such a big part of coming into recovery and letting go of the relationship that you have formed with your addictive behavior.
mm,
Because there's a lot to let go of when you're trying to come into recovery. There's a lot of positive that comes with being sober, but
mhm,
there are things that have to change. And those changes can cause reactions, just like you can have when you lose someone close
mhm.
to you. So, I saw that it was an area that we weren't really touching too much, and from that, I was also able to train our staff to be aware of it more so that we're making sure we don't miss it as a topic for all of our people.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a really important point here of that we form a relationship with alcohol, substances, gambling, whatever it may be, rage, people, exercise, like the shopping, the multitude of other addictions, right? We form this relationship with it, and when we're supposed to kind of give up that connection, almost that dependence, right? Because when we're looking at addiction, we're looking at codependence too, and we can be not codependent with an inanimate object, but dependent on
Mhm.
this thing. And that mimics almost like a relationship we might have with another person. So actually looking at it as that, as a relationship,
Yeah.
what what would you say when you're approaching this with a client, when you're approaching this with somebody who is new to the idea of grief addiction? How do you first come up, like, talk to them about the topic of the relationship to addiction, to alcohol, drugs, gambling?
Yeah, so I just go right into letting them know that grief is something that I focus on, and I
Mhm.
give them examples of what that can look like. And I say addiction grief and explain that that means looking at how your relationship with losing your addictive behavior
Mhm.
can impact you. And from that, they normally have questions or they
Mhm.
can already relate to it and start sharing. And we normally take the lens of looking at it as almost like a breakup, so
Mhm.
going through similar feelings and reactions as if you were losing someone that you were in an intimate relationship with, because with alcohol, substances, gambling, that thing is still going to be in your life technically because it's around in the community or just
Mhm.
in society. So it's not like we can think that, oh, it's just dead to you, it's
Mhm.
gone. I have to know how to interact with it in everyday life, knowing that I can maybe even miss it, but still know that I need better or I
Mhm.
need to change or I don't have
Mhm.
to go back to it. So
Mhm.
kind of validating that this experience can be a difficult one and
Mhm.
one that is worthy of grieving over, giving them permission to do
Mhm.
that.
Yeah, and that permission piece, because I think for so many people this feels like such a taboo, or I'm not allowed to go there topic. When you
Mhm.
think about a breakup, right? Like, we're looking at obviously the bad parts of the relationship, and maybe that being why it led to the ultimate ending, parting ways, separating. But then there are good parts too, and the same thing is said to be true for addiction. There's a reason why I continued to engage in this. It provided me something that I was seeking, something that I was wanting, something I was needing. Um, and the outcomes of that ended up being maladaptive, more harmful than they were actually relieving or helpful. But there were these quote unquote good parts to it. There's a reason I kept engaging in it. It worked
Mhm.
for a period. It
Yeah.
worked for whatever purpose I needed at that moment. How do you broach that piece with clients when we're talking about, yeah, there were positives. We're looking at that there was a reason, there was a purpose.
Mhm. Yeah, I think going back to giving them permission to grieve for it opens up that reality that grieving can mean that I can be upset that this is my reality, that I
Mhm.
even have to go through recovery. So we don't want to use toxic positivity of, look at all that you're going to
Yeah.
gain in recovery. This is all just so good, so
Mhm.
awesome. That can be true, but we need to give that person the side of, in reality, this could just really suck. That
Yeah.
this is something you have to find a way to change and recover from.
Mhm.
So framing it in that way helps them even open up the idea of what will I miss. And one of the articles that I read by Bates Maves talks about how we've got to address what's in the rear view mirror, those
Mm.
things that can
Yeah.
chase us down later in recovery. If I'm
Yeah.
not letting myself think about what I'll miss, then
Mhm.
it's like I have blinders
Mhm.
on. And when that inevitably comes up in the future, I'm
Mhm.
like, oh crap, I didn't even think of this. So I need to let myself know what I'm gonna miss about it,
Mhm.
say, "Okay, I can miss it, but still change."
Mhm. Yeah, that toxic positivity too that you touch on is so pinnacle in acknowledging that that's our go-to. We don't want to suffer, to feel miserable, to sit in the uncomfortable, the discomfort. So it feels sometimes easy to put in this positive mindset. Let me just completely switch and turn right and just pretend like everything's okay and recovery is going to be so great, but that's not true. It's going to have its ups and downs. It's going to have those moments where I'm like, "Oh my gosh, I really just want to go back to that quick fix that I got before."
Mhm,
And if we try to take on that toxically positive mindset, those blinders are going to blow off. We're going to be moving forward and that thing is going to be in front of us and I don't have the blinders to divert anymore because being toxically positive, it's a mask. It's only going to take me but so far.
mhm.
Um when when you're talking about this grieving process, how do you educate patients on what disenfranchised grief is? Because addiction grief 100% is falling in that category of it's not societally acceptable, quote
Mhm.
unquote, to
Yeah,
grieve something like addiction or other categories as well. How do you talk to
yeah.
clients about that?
I'm glad you brought that up because I
Mhm.
wanted to talk about it.
Mhm.
So, yeah, disenfranchised grief is grief that we have for losses or changes in our life that society, groups of people, or even just family and friends view as
Mhm.
not worthy of grieving over, or they have judgment or stigma
Mhm.
over the idea that you might grieve for this loss. So,
Mhm.
addiction does fall into that because if you were to say, talk to a family member who's uneducated about addiction and recovery and tell them, I really miss my drug of choice
Mhm.
right now. They
Mhm.
might go to the side of frustration or anger. How could you miss that? Not
Mhm.
knowing that there's that grief process. So I kind of help the clients understand that it
Mhm.
makes sense that friends and family might not view this as something worthy of grieving over. Maybe we need to help educate them as well
Mhm.
so that that can be someone who you're feeling more comfortable to share that with. Say you had a
Mhm.
really tough day and you want to come home and talk to your partner about, hey, I was really thinking about alcohol today
Mhm.
and I was missing it. I don't want to go back to it, but I just need to voice that.
Mhm.
And what we
Mhm.
know about grief in general is normally we just need someone to share it with so
Yeah.
that we can externalize it
Mhm.
and confront it and process it. So
Mhm.
I give them that education of why they've probably never really heard this perspective
Mhm.
before, or even if they haven't felt like they could really share it with many people and have them understand it.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say this is probably a common experience for a lot of people in early recovery or recovery in general that inevitably I get to the place where I miss it and I think about the quote unquote good times and it can feel so isolating if I don't know, where that's coming from, maybe why I'm feeling that way and that it's okay to feel that way because
Mhm.
that maybe stigma that we have from other people, I can 100% be placing that on myself and turn into this, well, I shouldn't feel this way if I haven't been exposed to kind of a process that will help normalize this for me, help me understand, see that this is okay. Like, this is very common.
Yeah.
Um, I would go as far to say I'm sure almost every addict has felt that at some point, that longing for it, not longing for the destruction that came after it, but the numbing of emotions, the ease in social interactions that these things can provide sometimes.
Mhm.
What would you say to family members who are supporting somebody in recovery when it comes to disenfranchised grief and maybe their own stigma that they might place on their family member?
Mhm. Yeah, so I definitely give them the educational side of
Mhm.
disenfranchised grief, what it even is, and then I'm normally asking them to be more open to the idea of hearing their loved one come to them with that grief and just be curious about it. Just want to
Mhm.
say, what was it today that made you miss it? Let's talk through
Mhm.
that. Or even just leave it open ended as, what do you need from me right now?
Mm.
Instead of being fearful of hearing your loved one share they were missing it and think, oh, worst case scenario, we've got to get you back into treatment. This is a
Mhm.
big red flag.
Mhm.
So, trying to help them be more curious instead of
Mhm.
fearful. It would
Mhm.
take time, right?
Yeah.
You need to see that your loved one's gonna share that with you and that you respond in the right way and that you keep building trust about it,
Mhm.
but I think that's the big thing I'm trying to help them
Yeah.
differentiate between of the fear response versus the just curious, "What can I do to help? Let's see what we've learned from these feelings that you had today."
Yeah. Yeah, and that curiosity too is reminding me as well of what compassion is and how we can simplify compassion to just really mean space. And when I give something space, then I have the capacity to be curious, to ask questions, to take the non-judgmental stance. And I think too, when we're talking about this specific way that family members might jump to fear, it really is like that place of worry. It's that place of, I don't want you to suffer again in this way. But what we're communicating to the other person is, I don't trust you. I don't want you to
Mhm.
tell me. I don't want to know. I don't, I'm going to immediately always go to worst case scenario. And that can kind of breed this ground for secret keeping and isolation. And then I'm not going to come to you because you're going
Mhm.
to explode, overreact, whatever it may be.
Right.
So maintaining compassion, curiosity, space, let's just talk about this. The more we're talking about something, I think too, the less room for going behind backs and secret keeping and all of that, because it's out in the open. I
Mhm.
If I don't feel judgment coming from this end, then I'm more willing to come to you and talk to you about it the next time. Um, and I think encouraging families in that way of like, it's normal to be scared, it's normal to be worried, it's normal to miss the substance, to have days you want to go back, just overall the normalcy, right? And I don't even like
Mhm.
the word normal because I don't think anything's normal.
Yeah.
But when we compare it to society, there is a societal norm. And letting people know that that doesn't always have to be our standard, the societal norm, or what society tries to tell us. The
Mhm.
norm is the human experience, what we actually think, feel, go through on a day to day.
Mhm.
How do you usually wrap up addiction grief work with somebody when you're seeing them? Maybe they're getting close to, if they're in residential, close to their discharge and about to go back out in the real world and really have to be confronted with this stuff again.
Yeah.
How would you wrap up that addiction grief process with them?
Yeah, well, if I'm really focusing on that with them throughout that process, we might do something called grief mapping, where
Mm,
we're going to look at different categories of their life and how letting go of their addictive behavior is changing because of it. So
mm,
we're looking at how their daily activities are going to be changing, their
mm,
interpersonal relationships, their faith and spirituality, the view of the
mm,
future, all these things that are going to impact their recovery, and
mm,
letting go of that behavior should overall bring a lot of positive change. But
mm,
looking at those categories also helps us look at what's going to feel like it's missing or lacking without
mm,
this. And is that just space that I need to fill up with something, or do I just need to say, this feeling that it gave me, I can't replicate, and I
mm,
have to come to peace with that.
mm,
So we'd work toward that, and I think in a final session with them, I just make sure that they are being compassionate with themselves, understanding that there are going to be some good days, some hard
mhm,
days, but that missing it doesn't have to mean I want to go back to it.
mm,
And that we've talked through this and made plans for those days so that
Mhm.
it doesn't have to be so scary. So just reminding them of their plan, reminding them of the resources or the people that they have in their life that they can talk to about this. So
Mhm.
even if they don't have family or friends that would understand, if they have a sponsor or a therapist or
Mhm.
someone
Mhm.
that they can share this with, really reinforcing that with them as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I like how you bring up the grief mapping too, because I think that is a piece that we need to hone in on as well is, the sadness aspect of whatever it is that we're losing or is now absent from our lives, but the what in everyday life is now different too. I can grieve for the person, the addiction, the thing, but every facet of my life is going to change as well. And that's I think when we're talking about the emotion of grief, the experience of grief, that's what will like gut punch me a month later is I didn't think about how work is now different because I don't have this thing.
Yeah.
Because maybe it was I longed for getting off work and go and have a drink to celebrate, you know, a job well done. That was my routine. And I had the sadness of I'm losing the alcohol, but I go back to work and now, whoa, this just hit me again. This is different. I've got to readjust again. And that brings back up that wave of grief, which is so important that we give space to. We recognize that.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and one other thing I didn't even mention that can go with this kind of grief is also the reality that letting go of my addictive behavior might mean I also have to let go of relationships with people that I
Mm-hmm.
engaged in the behavior with. So you might hear your therapist or sponsor say, identify the people in your sports that aren't actually that helpful or that are going to continue to use and remove them.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot more complicated than just saying, "I'm gonna remove them." So there
Right.
can even be a grieving process that goes on when you realize, "I might have to distance myself from these important people in my life," or, "I might have to cut them out," or, "I have to have hard conversations with them about
Mm-hmm.
what's has to change." So those are things to also point out early on in
Mm-hmm.
treatment to help people identify what do those conversations need to look like, but also validate that it's a lot easier said than done when it
Yeah.
comes to removing people or setting boundaries
Mm-hmm.
that will better support your recovery.
Yeah, and that's an important piece for us to kind of wrap up today is that it's a lot easier said than done. This is not okay, I just do this and it fixes all. This isn't that silver bullet, that thing that solves it all, right? It is much more complex, comes with emotions that we can't always explain, we can't always give logic to, and it's really the acceptance of that that's okay. And just because I took a step backwards today doesn't mean I won't take another step forwards tomorrow. Um, it's not linear. Healing's not linear, and the grief
Mhm.
process and the recovery process and any of it, I have
Yeah.
to maintain, a sense of compassion and grace for myself of that I'm going to mess up and that's okay. And it's going to be really hard one day and that's also okay. Um, there's better to come at the end of this, might not be instantaneous.
Mhm.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Setting those realistic expectations is very important.
100%. Well, thanks for talking with me
Of
about this today,
course.
Kelly.
Thanks for coming by.
And thanks for listening to our viewers out there.